A fast boat hurried to Istanbul with a panicked report from the Turkish commander-in-chief Hüseyin Pasha. Black news was from the category of those for which sometimes a contract worker was beheaded, and not only in Turkey. Pasha, however, did not exaggerate at all, but stated the pure truth. All attempts to storm failed. The losses are huge. The Crimeans do not want to fight. There is a shortage of food and ammunition. Without strong reinforcements, the basics perhaps cannot be taken. Worst of all, there is a growing murmur of discontent among the Janissaries that they have been dragged into such a hopeless and bloody enterprise. And that's really bad. The Janissaries by that time, in addition to serious combat skills, had accumulated a lot of experience in organizing rebellions, each time successful. Not only did the Janissaries overthrow the ministers and viziers of something like the prime minister, they got to the sultans without any ceremony if they wanted to. In 6 years, in 1617, in 1623 years, as a result of the Janissary riots, 4 sultans were replaced on the throne. Moreover, if the deposed sultan just found himself in a dungeon, with his eyes gouged out, he could seriously consider that he was very lucky. Sometimes they killed without hesitation. Professional warriors were also professional rebels. If he had thought of rebelling about her this time, Hüseyin Pasha simply would have had no one to oppose them. 2 regiments of European mercenaries would not have stood up against a considerable number of Janissaries, despite all their military experience, and it's ridiculous to talk about the Crimean Tatars. They would have simply run away. Pasha wrote, "There is nothing to fight with, but it is dishonorable to go away. The Ottoman weapons have never seen such a disgrace. We have fought for whole kingdoms and triumphed over victories, and now we bear the shame of a handful of insignificant warriors." And in conclusion, he expressed a sad thought with might and main: should we postpone the siege until the spring of next year, when the weather will be favorable? It's about to go bad. They did not cut the heads of the Pasha's messengers, but they put them under lock and key immediately, so that, keeping Allah, they would not tell anyone too much. The pardoned courtier, the Grand Vizier, did not even dare to read the Pasha's message to the Sultan in its entirety. Omitting the most unsightly places, he was afraid of an outburst of anger, after which heads would fly like autumn leaves. Well, the fact that Sultan Ibrahim was the first to hear was enough for him to go into a wild rage. Rumbled in response, "Pasha, take the basics, or give your head." Everyone knew perfectly well that such words from the Sultan's lips were not an empty threat. However, the Sultan, having slightly recovered from anger, nevertheless sent reinforcements to Azov. 15 war galleys with Janissaries, and in addition to the bag of gold. Now the Janissary had to receive good money for the head of each killed Cossack. 100 gold piastres. Personally, it is absolutely incomprehensible to me how it was possible to establish real accounting and control in the payment of these bonuses. In addition to the words of the Janissary, convincing evidence is needed. Bring the severed head of a slain enemy. But while you're chopping this head off in the heat of battle, you risk losing your own. And after the battle, it may well turn out that someone resourceful has already cut off the heads of the Cossacks you killed, and quickly rushed for a reward. And again, fierce bombing, attacks of Cossack sortie, but Azov holds on. Kargalev, who described this story in detail, cites the testimony of an eyewitness, the Turk Evli Çelebi. The eyewitness describes in detail: the military leaders and officers gathered at the Great Military Council said that it was impossible to take the fortress, that one should seriously expect a Janissary revolt, that with the onset of winter the Sea of Azov would freeze, and sea communication with Turkey would become impossible, that someone suspected the Cossacks. He started a rumor that the Moscow Tsar was moving to the aid of Azov with a 20,000th army, and although the rumor is undoubtedly false, the confusion in the camp is serious. If anything, you will have to spend the winter in the open air, with a meager supply of provisions. And yet another attack. The Janissaries managed to break into the center of the fortress, plant the Sultan's banner there, and hold out for 7.5 hours. But the Cossacks resisted so much that after dark the Janissary commanders took their people out of the fortress. More bombing, more attacks. It's useless. In the end, another council was held, at which 300 viziers and officers of various ranks signed an opinion, in which they said that it was impossible to seize the fortress that year, Chelyabinsk. However, in order to save face, 2 captured Cossacks were sent to Azov, telling them to tell their own if the Turks wanted. They would have taken this lousy Azov in a month, having once done away with the miserable Cossacks. But since their real goal was to devastate the Russian lands and seize rich loot, and this goal has been achieved, the Turks are leaving. Shaitan is with you, live as long as we are generous. On the 26th of September, 1641, the besiegers left. The Turks boarded the ships and sailed to Futterland. The Crimean Tatars galloped to their native steppes with great relief. The Kabardian Circassians and Nogai who participated in the siege also hurried home. The great sitting lasted 93 days and 93 nights. The Cossack victory was glorious. The Turkish losses were calculated by the Cossacks and the archers sent by the Tsar from Astrakhan, and later, under Peter the Great, Admiral Cornelius Kruis, about 21,000 people, not counting all kinds of wagon trains of navvies, wounded and sick. As for the Cossacks, reinforcements broke through to them more than once, even during the siege of Azov, so that 8,000 to 9,000 people passed through the Great Seat. No more than 3,000 people were left alive, completely wounded. Hussein Pasha died on the way back, which saved him from the block. The enraged Sultan ordered the execution of a considerable number of military leaders of the defeated army. I have a suspicion that among them were all 300 signatories of the decision to lift the siege. In anger, the Turkish sultans did not trifle in such matters. The Tsar of Moscow also had his own headache. The Don embassy invited him to take Azov under his high hand. It was an extremely tempting offer, but there was too much to weigh and judge, guided not by emotions, but by harsh reality. The Tsar proposed to the Zemsky Sober to think hard, and in modern terms, to calculate the consequences and monetary expenses. They thought and cheated. Only for a trip to Azov for his occupation and recovery. Only ruins remained of Azov, it would have taken 221,000 rubles. For those times, the amount is fantastic, and this is only the cost of classes and recovery. In the future, it would have been necessary to keep at least 10,000 archers in Azov, which meant new serious expenses, salaries, food, gunpowder and lead, guns and cannons. And in addition, the occupation of Azov would mean a big war with Turkey. It was clear that the Sultan would never calm down, and would certainly begin a new siege. The Azov mine was located at a great distance from the then Russian borders. The Don army was not yet under the close control of Moscow. The Turks could cut the supply routes both on land and by river. In addition, another Crimean horde or even Janissaries would inevitably follow the invasion of southern Russia. And in the west, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which can take advantage of an advantageous moment and attack again. In the north, Sweden, which at that time had one of the strongest armies in Europe, and there have long been looking with bad interest at the Novgorod lands. Not so long ago, during the time of troubles, they had already fallen once, albeit briefly, under the Swede. In general, as the offer was not attractive, we had to reluctantly refuse it, and the Turks returned to Azov. Only more than 50 years later, Peter the Great will take Azov with the help of Austrian military engineers. By that time, the borders of Russia had moved further south, and the Don army was under control, and Turkey was slightly weakened after the crushing defeat at Vienna in 1683. However, in the 1711th year, the Turks had to return Azov after a disastrous campaign. For Peter the Great, the raids of the Crimean Tatars began again, with which it was impossible to fight with full force, because all the forces were spent on more than 20 years of the northern war with the Swedes. However, quite quickly after Peter's death, not raids will begin, but the real military campaigns of Russians in the Crimea. About them a little later. So far, we, staying in the same time, will move to the west, to the banks of the Dnieper. I hope you have already formed some idea of what Crimea was like by that time. Let's look now, let's take a closer look at what Ukraine was like, where even today many consider Crimea to be an integral part of an independent power. To begin with, there was no country called Ukraine at all. As well as Ukrainians, as well as the Ukrainian language. The word Ukraine in the Russian language of that time meant only the outskirts. And there were a great many such Ukrainians. Both Siberian cities and Solovetsky Island were called Ukrainian. In the Novgorod Chronicle of 1571st year, it is mentioned about the attack of the Crimean Tatars on the Tula Ukraine, and in 1625 year, the voivodes write to the Tsar in Moscow that they fear the arrival of the Tatars in our Ukraine. They write from the gate. Under Peter the Great, a folk song with the following lines appeared in Siberia, in his Siberian Ukraine, in the Dorian side. The Dorian side, Dorio. This is Transbaikalia. There was no Ukraine. And what happened? Well, it's not difficult to tell about it in detail, because we know a lot about that time. After the Tatar invasion of Russia, the Russian principalities, if I may say so, set off on their own, not by their own will. Two centers of power appeared, diligently subordinating one principality to another. In the north, the Moscow Principality gradually strengthened and annexed the neighboring lands, turning them from practically independent possessions into province states. The Western Russian principalities were ruled by Lithuania. This principality has little to do with today's Lithuania. Its full name is the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Russian and Mehmet. Then Lithuania. This is, in general, the current Belarus, with some differences in the borders. The then Memotia, the current Lithuania, and the Russian lands, including these areas that are part of Ukraine today. In 1569th year, Poland and the Grand Duchy signed an agreement known as the Union of Lublin, according to which they united into one state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The administrative territorial division was simple: the Crown, the former Poland, and the Principality, the former Grand Duchy of Lithuania. According to this union, all Russian lands, i.e. Ukraine, passed from Lithuania to the Crown. It is the Russians. Even Galicia, the future cradle of Ukrainian nationalism, in the official state papers of the speech, and we will continue to refer to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for brevity. The Russian voivodeship is called. The inhabitants of these Russian lands were called either Russins or Little Russians. Even then, the term Little Russia, that is, Little Russia, or still Russians, was in use. Russians too, they called themselves, and they spoke in Russian, except with some addition of purely local words. There is nothing unusual about this. A typical phenomenon for many Russian regions, where sometimes there are hundreds of purely local words that are understandable only for residents of this area. A simple example from the life of my native Siberia. In the morning, the old Prussian woman says to her old man, the same Russian. Lani Minasinsky eyes with a siver have been scratched, barely Borovshana with a name. But you also understood a lot, if you are, say, a native of St. Petersburg or Rostov. In general, a resident of European Russia. And the phrase is simple, and in the Siberian dialect, now almost forgotten, means only that the other day, the guys from Minasinsk passed along the northern slope of the hill, leading to large males. There are a great many local dialects, from Arkhangelsk to the Far East. However, no one in Russia, well, with the exception of individual schizophrenics, makes a conclusion on this basis about the existence of a special Pomeranian or Siberian nation, the Arkhangelsk or Siberian languages. So, the then inhabitants of the Ukraine outskirts had their own Move Russian language, with an admixture of regional dialects and foreign words borrowed from the nearest neighbors. This was the case in many countries. In Russia, until the end of the 18th century, the nobility called themselves the Polish word gentry. In Poland itself, the word bedtie is borrowed from French, and browarnia, that is a brewery, comes from the German brover. And so on. There are many examples. Russians are the proof that the inhabitants of the future Ukraine considered themselves to be Russians, and their language to be Russian, can be found not in the writings of stubborn Russian nationalists as someone might think. It is enough to recall the classics of Polish literature, Henryk Sienkiewicz's trilogy with Fire and Sword, The Flood, Pan Wolodyewski. These novels still enjoy such love and respect in Poland that they are often referred to simply as a trilogy, with a capital letter, and without mentioning the author's name. Everyone already knows what kind of trilogy we are talking about. She's the only one. The events there take place in the second half of the 17th century. It tells a picturesque and fascinating story about the glorious nobles who bravely fought with the Swedes, Turks, Crimean Tatars, and Ukrainian Cossacks. So, the main character of the novel of the same name is the famous knight, the famous Colonel Pan Wolodyewski, and his friends associates call themselves the Russian gentry every now and then. By religion, they are Catholics, descendants of Orthodox Russian nobles who adopted this faith. Russians serve the Polish crown faithfully in wars with its numerous enemies, but at the same time, they constantly emphasize that they are not just gentry, but Russian gentry, since they were born on the Russian lands that are part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. There is a clear division. There are Polish gentry, there are Lithuanian gentry, that is, Belarusian, there is Russian. Pan Wolodyewski and his fellow countrymen call themselves Ukrainians, and the Ukrainian language will not come to mind even in a nightmare. They simply do not suspect the existence of such curiosities. Russians were born on Russian soil, and sometimes they switch from Polish to Russian, rising. From the Russian land, there is a Tsar. And there will be no power in the world that would not submit to him. Sienkiewicz's testimony is all the more valuable because the said panwriter was an avid Polish nationalist and had no sympathy for the Russian Empire or the Russians, which he certainly did not have there. However, in his novels, he adhered to historical accuracy and did not invent any Ukrainians, since this concept simply did not exist in the 17th century. A small digression on the topic of nationalism, a little snide. The ardent Polish nationalist Pan Sienkiewicz did not have a drop of Polish blood in his veins. His mother is Litvinka, his father, a descendant of the Tatars, who once settled in Poland. This often happens to nationalists in various countries. Let's go back to the middle of the 17th century, on the banks of the Dnieper. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth firmly held the right bank, i.e. Western Ukraine. After the Union of Lublin, the formal colonization of it by Poles began. The task was made easier for the Poles by the fact that the Russian Orthodox nobility, like its brethren in many countries, thought first of all about their own good, and, for the sake of preserving their sometimes huge land holdings and serious noble privileges, most of them converted to Catholicism. Little by little, she got drunk, and her descendants were already loyal vassals of the Polish crown. But on the left bank of today's eastern Ukraine, there were, of course, not a state, but two relatively independent regions, the so-called Hetman Ukraine, much less known to most, and the Zaporozhye Sich, much more known. The population of the Hetmanate largely consisted of Cossacks, and the Zaporozhian Sich was entirely made up of them. In the Hetmanate, there were enough simple farmers and artisans, but the Sich did not conduct any economy except perhaps for distilling, and was engaged exclusively in Cossacks, that is, raids on neighbors. The Free Cossacks gradually formed just in a wild field, even if it did not belong to anyone, but it was not deserted at all. The nature of voids, as is known, does not tolerate, and these places attracted a lot of risky people, who liked just complete anarchy, and the opportunity to live freely. Some of them existed by hunting and fishing, hiding their huts in deep ravines and other hidden places, so as not to attract the attention of the Tatars, which is colorfully described by Sienkiewicz in Fire and Sword. Another, perhaps, that most of such a vegetable existence despised. For people of a certain type, it was much more interesting to live by robberies. In those places, the Tatars drove their herds, and merchants often passed by, so there was where and what to profit from. Gradually, over the decades, from those who traded not with a fishing rod or a plow, but with a saber, a rather large group formed, calling itself the Cossacks. The word Cossack is actually Turkic, but there is nothing surprising in this. There were enough Turks among the Cossacks who settled in the wild field because of the same desire for absolute freedom. It is not for nothing that an interesting custom was noted among the Turks at one time. They immediately sorted the captured Cossacks into Slavs and Turks. The first usually cut off their heads without any fuss, but the second had to suffer. The Zaporozhye Sich was a model of the most perfect democracy. The leaders' atamans were chosen by universal suffrage. However, this does not mean that the voting took place decorously and nobly, often accompanied by fierce altercation, and even fights both with fists and with sabers. The famous Scot Patrick Gordon, who later served with Peter the Great, who happened to witness one of the election campaigns, described in detail in his memoirs how the supporters of the two candidates fought so fiercely that there was no way to separate them with persuasion. A certain Cossack colonel stopped this outrage, only ordering to throw a few hand grenades at the fighting, primitive compared to the current ones, but quite lethal. Such a sad and cheerful democracy was. However, the elected ataman at any time, if something was not to his liking, could be thrown off, as easy as it was chosen, or even put it in the water, in other words, drown it like a kitten. A similar situation of an instant change of power is described in detail by Gogol. Taras Bulba, who arrived in the Sich, categorically did not like the ataman of that time, because he forbade the Cossacks to raid the Tatars, referring to the absurd circumstance that a peace treaty was concluded with them. But what kind of agreements can there be with the Basarmans? With cynical simplicity, the glorious Taras roared and went to the people. I rolled out a couple of barrels of vodka, conducted explanatory work. New elections took place very quickly, as a result of which a new ataman appeared, who agreed with Taras that there could be no agreements with the Basarmans in principle, and therefore. Lads on the horse. In the Hetmanate, where there was some kind of administration and a semblance of written legislation, there was much less violence and pranks, but the hetman was also an electoral figure, and like everyone else, whose voters could lose their post, however, as a result of more complex procedures than those electoral technologies that Taras Bulba used. Whatever it was, little by little, the Cossacks became a well-organized and serious military force that eventually achieved the independence of Hetman Ukraine. The Zaporozhye Sich, a fortified camp at the Dnieper Rapids, was initially independent. As a matter of fact, these two free republics formed one whole. Simply, the Sich was a purely military camp, where women were not allowed, and there was no economy. But many Zaporozhtsi, like the same Taras Bulba, just had a farm, wives and children in the Hetmanate, and went to the Sich to pack when another friendly visit to one of the neighbors was planned. Farms have not always been small. By the middle of the 17th century, a kind of aristocracy stood out in the Hetmanate, a Cossack foreman, who took possession of farms, estates, entire villages, who carried the ranks of colonels, centurions, yesuls, who eventually put the rank and file in a subordinate, albeit not yet serf, position. Under the outward sign of democracy, that is, the election of the hetman, two opposing aspirations were hidden. Ordinary Cossacks and peasants, grassroots, Golota, wanted more freedom. And the foreman, on the contrary, secretly longed to acquire the same rights enjoyed by the polished gentleman, whom the foreman looked at with secret envy. It's time to clarify, the whole Hetman Ukraine consisted only of the current Chernihiv and Poltava regions. And that's all. The state was, as we see, quite small, but belligerent. The company was too numerous and inveterate to break it with the forces of the Polish regular army and subdue it like the right bank. In addition, the Cossacks often opposed the Poles in alliance with the Crimean Tatars. In general, the most unexpected collisions happened. At one time, the Poles took some of the Cossacks into their service, putting them in the so-called register, which is why those who got there began to be called registered Cossacks. From time to time, those registered on the side of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth participated in wars against the Crimean Khan and the Turks, and sometimes against the Muscovite kingdom, somehow not being embarrassed by the fact that they are fighting with the same Orthodox. In short, the situation in those places resembled an old joke about partisans, Germans, and a forester. However, there was no forester. Today, part of the Cossacks, in cordial agreement with the Crimean Tatars, raided Polish lands or Moldavia. Tomorrow, yesterday's allies were whipped to death. The day after tomorrow, Poles swooped in the company of registered Cossacks and hacked those and those. Sometimes wars broke out for the most outlandish reasons that simply had no analogues in European practice. For example, the Cossacks attacked the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth twice, not with the aim of plundering or standing up for the Orthodox faith, but solely in order to get into the service of the Poles. That's right, no mistake. The fact is that the number of registered ones was limited by a kind of limit. But it was much more interesting for too many to travel freely finally, with a saber on his belt, than as a second-class person, to bend his back on the colonel's arable land. And the privileges of the registry were almost schleckety. The Cossacks demanded to increase the register. The Poles reasonably replied that the registry is not rubber. It was then that the Cossacks invaded the Polish lands twice, proclaiming loudly, "We will cut, rob and burn, until you take service." It was. Hetman Ukraine did not have complete, absolute, 100% independence. Do not be lazy to look at the map to properly assess its size. The neighbors were immeasurably stronger. Such a situation developed considerable, let's say, diplomatic talents in the hetmans. I constantly had to maneuver between the Polish king, the Crimean Khan, the Turkish Sultan, and the Moscow Tsar, often swearing allegiance to one of them. Bohdan Khmelnytsky for a long time, in full accordance with political realities, signed his decrees as the hetman of His Royal Grace of the Zaporozhian Army, even during the 6 years of war with the Polish king. In general, any hetman had a position that you would not wish on the enemy. It was necessary not only to maneuver between the 4 crowned persons mentioned above, but also to be able to please their own foreman, who often had a habit of plotting serious plots against the hetman, and also to take into account the moods of the grassroots and hungry without taking them to extremes, because they could always rebel. The position, in a word, is unenviable. And now let's move on to the event known as the reunification of Ukraine with Russia. The name is not quite appropriate. Not all of Ukraine has been reunited with Russia, but only a small part of it. But these are minor quibbles, we will not deal with them. Let's take a closer look at the main initiator of this event, Bohdan Khmelnytsky. In Soviet times, of course, this person was supposed to be portrayed exclusively white and fluffy, as a noble hero, concerned only with the reunification of 2 fraternal peoples. Meanwhile, everything is more complicated. Khmelnytsky came from a small Orthodox szlachectwo. He was educated at a Polish Jesuit college and served the Polish crown fairly regularly for some time. It was the king who appointed him centurion in Chigirin. However, later, some unceremonious nobleman with his scumbags attacked the birthday girl of Khmelnytsky. The usual fun in those places. Neighbors often raided each other. He plundered everything he could, Khmelnytsky's son by the cheek to death, and took his concubine with him. She must have been very pretty. Having failed to find the truth from the Polish king, who practically did not have the ability to punish noble minks, so that they did not create, mortally offended, Khmelnytsky fled to the Cossacks, was elected hetman, gathered an army, and began to fight the fields. The war went on for a long time, and with varying success. There was a time when Khmelnytsky controlled Galicia, Volhynia, and Podolsk. However, it should be clarified that the success of Khmelnytsky depended on one single fact: the presence or absence of Crimean Tatars. When Khmelnytsky fought against the Poles in the company of the Crimean hospital, he always beat them. When I had to fight alone, it turned out the opposite every time. What else in Soviet times, historians innocently and artlessly recalled. Yes, Khmelnytsky lost the battle, but it's all the fault of the Crimean Tatars, who did not come to the rescue.